what causes these assets to not get drawn until you get close to them. So if you look at all this stuff that's getting loaded in right now, you'll see a ton of stuff. Lots and lots of assets that get loaded one by one, and most of these assets are underground, right? So if they're underground and compartmentalized, you know, tons and tons of assets that I've loaded into all these different rooms of this map, we're gonna see this stuff is going to be not visible most of the time in the game. But if we understand how the game draws all this stuff, every time, every frame, it's drawing everything that you can see, and everything that's actually in your frame, whether it's behind something or not. So just because it's down here and I can't see it when I'm up here, it's actually drawing it. But we have a tool as map makers to improve the performance of the game on our map. We can come in here and we can build under special items, occlusion volume, occlusion trigger. Alright, so this is really cool because with an occlusion volume, you can have anything inside of that occlusion volume, any assets inside that, won't be drawn unless somebody is inside of the trigger, or inside of the volume, or inside of the trigger that's associated to that volume. So until, if you're, you know, back down here, you wouldn't be able to see any of those assets until you got into the trigger or inside of the volume, and then everything would actually get drawn. This is fantastic for improving the draw speed of the game, improving frame rates of players in that. So if I was to build one of these occlusion volumes that covers, say, everything underground, or maybe just everything inside of that, room, then until somebody is inside of the trigger, let's build a trigger that is even bigger for that room. Let's say that's even bigger, right? Or I just connect it here, right? Now that trigger is associated to that occlusion volume. All of these assets inside of this occlusion volume here, or that this occlusion volume touches, none of these assets are visible unless somebody is inside of that volume or this trigger that's associated to that volume. So they step inside of this trigger, and then these start getting drawn for them when they're looking at that. This is you know, game changing for making your maps, you know, perform the game's performance when somebody's playing your map a lot better. And if you're not really sure how you would want to use this because you're worried about, let's say, using this over here for objects that are inside of this area, but it's gonna make all of, you know, this other stuff that's getting touched not be drawn by people who are outside of here, you can create groups that, you know, if you group all of these objects together here, you only want those objects that are grouped to get occluded by this occlusion volume. You group them, and then those are what's going to be occluded when you put this here by using this. Oh, that's my trigger. Why don't we use the trigger? Only detect groups. So it will now only be an occlusion volume for items that are grouped that it touches. Does that make sense? So now we have an occlusion. Now we have a group. That group is objects that we only want drawn when somebody's inside of the volume or the trigger that surrounds that volume. And now the game will perform a lot better when people are playing on this map for that. Now, obviously, I haven't taken the time to really perfect the grouping or the size and placement of these occlusion volumes, but that is something that I'm going to do when I'm not actively talking about it. So that's occlusion volumes, and that's sort of a quick rundown of how the game actually renders this stuff. So if I'm standing back here, I don't even know whether you can tell, but it is actually starting to glitch and frame as I try to start turning my head through here, because of everything that it's trying to draw. There's a lower frame rate as I'm trying to turn my head through center. Everything is working kind of perfectly as I look over here. There's no assets over here, but as I start to turn my head and it has to try and draw all of that stuff because those assets are all there, it starts to stutter and lower the frame rate. Because there's just 759,000 polys that it's trying to draw. It does a draw call for every single frame in my view, right? Every single frame. So the frame rate drops when it's trying to see all of that stuff. If I put occlusion volumes out in areas where there's stuff that I don't need the game to be drawing all of this stuff. If I'm up here and all I see is snow, right? Or if I'm not in this room, if say I'm in this room over here, right? I only need the game to be drawing what's in this room. Now maybe I don't have the function to create the occlusion volume that just touches these trees or whatever. So maybe the trees constantly get drawn even when I'm underground. But I don't necessarily need to see everything I don't need everything that's over here in these rooms over here drawn when I'm in this room. And I don't need everything that's in this room drawn when I'm over in this room. Or any of these other rooms, right? So you create an occlusion volume that covers this room, and maybe you just have the groups so that it only occludes the stuff that's actually in a group in this room. But that way, and then you can create a trigger, for the stuff that's just in this door, the trigger in the doorway. That way, as you enter this doorway, you see what's in that room without actually entering the room. I'm trying to be redundant as I explain this, because I think occlusion volumes are an incredibly powerful tool that I am just starting to get an understanding of how to use. They will, I know that on the official maps, the ones that the devs created for the game, the campaign maps and stuff, they use occlusion volumes sort of brilliantly to make the game perform really, really, really well for those maps. And we want to try and do that with our maps too, because we don't want the game to frame. We don't want to burn down Quest headsets just because people are just trying to play the game on the maps that we make. So occlusion volumes are absolutely huge, and that's a little bit about how Unity performs, or rather Unity creates all of this when we play the game, right?